Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I can see lots of friendly faces, which is always a good sign. My name's John Bew, and I'm a professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London, just across the road. And it gives me great pleasure and trepidation to introduce two friends today who are going to slug it out. I know that Dr. Schake, of course, will be known to many of you, and all of you, I hope, as the Deputy Director of IISS, and I won't give her a great introduction. I just want to let you know a little secret, which is that in order to be prepared for the hand-to-hand combat we're expecting to see today, Dr. Schake has actually been involved in what we're going to describe as some football hooliganism, having recently travelled to see Crystal Palace play Liverpool to get a sense of British combat.
I have highway flares I'm going to light and throw when Patrick starts talking.
Okay, so we are ready for that. So as I say, I'm not going to do, Kori, the privilege of saying too much about her and her background. You all know it. It's her home fixture. I will introduce our first speaker, Patrick Porter, who again will be known to many of you. He's Associate Fellow of RUSI. He's previously of the Strategic Studies Programme at Exeter. Most recently, I think this is his first academic year as Professor of International Security and Strategy at the University of Birmingham. And importantly, and I think for the trigger for today's event and today's debate, are a couple of recent articles he's written, one in International Affairs, and a latter, dare I say, slightly more provocative one for the Cato Institute on a world imagined about the liberal international order. So the way today's debate is going to work is that the away speaker, Patrick Porter, will speak first for about 8 to 10 minutes, and I'll be a strict chair. Then the home fixture, Dr. Schake, will respond for about 8 to 10 minutes. We'll have a little chance for each speaker to respond to each other, and then hopefully we'll open it up to you, ladies and gentlemen, and I will be a strict chair because the bar is behind us, and it's approaching that time of the afternoon. We'll all need some alleviation after this exciting scrap. So Patrick will begin by dismantling the liberal international order before Dr. Schake tries to build it again. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kori. Comrades, great powers, contrary to Madeleine Albright, do not see further. They tell themselves sweet stories. They forget things. Now, distressed by the coming of Donald Trump, a number of visionaries look back on what they see as a post-1945 American-made liberal rules-based order. They believe that this was an order based on regularity and rules, on international institutions, on democratic alliances, on free trade. In fact, a kind of Enlightenment project. I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong for three reasons. First of all, I think it's not true. I think there's way too much other stuff that happened in a very mixed diplomatic history for this to stand as a narrative. Secondly, it's wrong because liberal order itself is a contradiction in terms. The process of ordering the planet is a deeply illiberal one, very compromised, sometimes violent, always imperial. And thirdly, this matters because it's dangerous. It harms our ability to accept compromise in a world of change. Now, the primal scene for this mythology is what's known as the Truman Moment, when Harry Truman gathered the delegates of the world to set up the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. Well, that same president had all of the delegates spied on, and all of the telegrams were intercepted by US military intelligence, and the reports were given to the Foreign Secretary over breakfast. That same president cleared the decks, as it were, in Asia for the New World Order by launching atomic strikes on Imperial Japan, introducing a genocidal weapon into the world. So this, from the beginning, was an order born not just in consent and Enlightenment projects, but in violence and rough politics. An obvious problem, though, was that the whole world never submitted to any kind of liberal order. This is a very partial thing. Vast swathes of Eurasia didn't join the club. The Warsaw Pact, non-aligned India, the hint's in the name, and a standing embarrassment to this mythology is the People's Republic of China, which even after it joined the WTO in 2001 remains a deeply illiberal state politically and deeply illiberal economically. It has never accepted the level playing field of free trade. It is a trade cheat, it is a cyber thief, and it's never got on board. Now, but even within its own sphere, the liberal order contained a lot of coercion, a lot of illiberal behaviour, a lot of alignments with illiberal forces. I'm going to step lightly over America's partners in the Gulf, the Gulf monarchies, those liberal, stabilising, rules-based powers, bankrolling Wahhabism, bankrolling Saddam Hussein's onslaught on Iran, executing people for homosexuality and apostasy, this week outlawing satire. We should talk instead of America's long tradition of post-war collaboration with Islamist militants, from Dwight Eisenhower's welcoming of the Muslim Brotherhood into the Oval Office, to Brzezinski's Ark of Islam to contain the Soviet Union with jihadism from northeast Africa all the way to Central Asia, to American sponsors jihads in Afghanistan and Bosnia. This is the antithesis of liberalism. We should speak also of US-backed coups against this principle of democratic self-determination, against democratically elected governments in Iran, Congo, Guatemala, Brazil, Chile and East Timor. But the point of battle is mostly for the liberal nostalgia in continental Europe and in East Asia. But in these places too, we see a much more mixed record. We don't often talk about, for example, the Pact of Madrid between the United States and General Franco's Spain. We don't often talk about the Italian election of 1948, in which the CIA spread fake news and covertly funded one side. I hope it sounds familiar. NATO was not always a democratic club. It contained authoritarian regimes, Greece, Portugal and Turkey. Even the proud social democracy of West Germany was governed partly by Third Reich holdovers. And the US constantly tamed this Europe back into order with quiet threats of coercion and withdrawal of patronage. In East Asia, we see a similarly tragic story. The reality of millions dead, sometimes at the hands of our own client states of brutal dictatorships, the dead of Vietnam, the dead of Cambodia, the millions killed overall, but also the murderous anti-Red Purge in Indonesia with CIA help. Let us not romanticise Asian communism, but let us not mistake Asian anti-communism with liberal order. Now, it's true that South Korea and Taiwan and Japan became prosperous societies under an American shield, but they did so with deeply paternalistic, state-protected capitalism. This was not free trade. It was the shield of protectionism. Peace was later purchased in Asia under the Nixon-Mao settlement, but with a set of principles and bargains that offend liberal principles. The recognition of a communist state, the selling out of dissidents in Taiwan and Tibet. The US itself did not ever bind itself to free trade. It may have lowered tariffs to its credit, but non-tariff protectionism endured. Now, there were, in fact, real liberal projects, but often these liberal projects had illiberal results, and I'll mention just two of them. The top-down accelerated market shock therapy inflicted on Russia at the end of the Cold War, which helped breed the predatory oligarchy that we're now worried about in Moscow, and the genuine intention with the war in Iraq to liberate a region, to catalyse change in a region along democratic and capitalist lines that gave rise to empowered sectarians and then the Islamic State blowback. But there is a deeper era to talk about here. It's not just on the column of illiberal acts, because this is a mixed record. It's that we can't look back on this as Camelot because liberal order itself is a contradiction in terms. Ordering the planet is a rough business. It's hierarchical. It's often imperial in the sense of exerting rule beyond one's borders. The world is, in fact, as you know, a large and conflicted and damned inconvenient place. It presents a tragic choice of agonies. Resistance might arise. It needs to be suppressed. Proxies might not be good liberals, but at best lesser evils. Allies can grow and become economic competitors like Japan in the 1980s. A true economic level playing field might threaten the superpower's supremacy. The ordering state might feel that it has to cheat, to break rules to enforce order, to preach free trade while practicing protection, to retain its freedom of action. And it exercises a number of privileges. I've mentioned the protectionist privilege. There's the great, lavish agricultural subsidies, for example, that overproduce, that dump on world markets. There's the vigilante privilege, where after 2001, the United States gave itself effectively a global hunting license that conducts raids at will, sometimes signature drone strikes, sometimes without the consent of the local sovereign authority. This reflects, I think, an imperial concept of territory, wrong or right, up or down. As the 9/11 Commission itself said, the American homeland is the planet. And there, of course, is the opt-out privilege, where the United States either doesn't sign up to institutions like UNCLOS or occasionally violates the very prescriptions of those institutions at will. So What do we do with all this? To anticipate an objection, one argument might be all of that's true, it's not perfect, there was illiberal behaviour, there was hypocrisy, but that doesn't invalidate the ambition for liberal order, that these things were aberrations that don't condemn the original system. My argument, actually, though, is that the hypocrisies, the privileges, the picking and choosing of rules and norms and institutions were not bugs or viruses, they were the features of a system, that the system works in that way because it is imperial. It rests upon a great power exercising privileges it would not tolerate from other great powers. That's not because America's bad, it's because life in a tragic state of anarchy is tragic. But what do we do with all this? I think it matters because visions of liberal order that regard that order ahistorically as sacred make it harder to accept compromise and to think about hard choices and change. We are entering a world, I think, of competitive multipolarity, of fiscal overstretch, a very dangerous cycle of war and debt, where the US needs to think about compromise in order to make its power sustainable and to survive. Now, at this point, Chomskyite leftists and isolationist rightists and liberal perfectionists might draw a conclusion that the only choice is for America to dismantle its empire and bring the legions home. But I think that would also be an error, because it repeats the error of liberal order, which is a desire for statecraft without compromise. I think something else has to happen, some kind of middle ground between isolation and perpetual domination. In fact, I'm quite sympathetic with America's post-war condition as it found it, that in projecting power and ordering the world, it faced choices where it might have to bargain with dictators, it might have to do deals with criminals and zealots, it might have to use the atomic bomb, it might have to use bribes and coercion. No major power can avoid this. But in order to make better choices, choices of quality, we need to look at the actual history, not the lullaby version of the history. Otherwise, this will lead us to where, ironically, the liberal order visionaries least want to get, which is the moment when the United States fails to adjust, exhausts, maybe bankrupts itself, destroys its domestic democracy, and comes home. A US Marine officer recently said to me, we, the United States, can't pay the bills anymore, and sooner or later the troops will come home as a result. So if we want to avoid that fate, if we want to avoid the myth of liberal order driving the United States into exhaustion, then we're going to need a dose of realism. And by realism, I mean the best definition, which is the capacity to look at the world without euphemism. The end.
Thank you, Patrick. Perfect timing. Excellent. Kori.
So there is a lot so I should start by saying that I agree with the sweep of history that Patrick has described. I won't contest that that since 1945, the United States, as the strongest power in the international order and the leader of the so-called liberal international order, has made compromises with shady governments, has set rules it broke, has had an in-and-out relationship with the institution. All of those things are true. The other thing that Patrick's very good sermon raises for me is that those of us who believe that the post-1945 international order that the United States constructed is different, more stable, and normatively better than previous international orders, are extraordinarily lazy in how we engage this debate. And it's one of the reasons I'm so grateful that Patrick was willing to cross swords with me on it. Because here at the IISS, we want to have a sharp-edged building of intellectual capital by testing arguments. And what I think the defenders of the liberal international order do poorly is we're vague and kind of hand-waving, and we're not concrete about what the order is or what would be different if you didn't have it. So the international order that was constructed after 1945 by the United States has three basic elements. The first is the extension of security guarantees to preferred countries, some of them countries we were afraid of, Germany and Japan, some of them countries we liked better than others, Britain and sometimes France. So security guarantees in order to stabilize the relationships that had been seen by the United States as drivers of conflict twice in the 20th century. So security guarantees to bring the strongest power into alliance with others and therefore not require them or us to bear the entire cost of the stabilization of international relations. The second element of it was to legitimate American power by giving weaker powers a say on what the rules would be and some form of maybe not veto power, but institutionalized influence over American decisions. This is where you get to international institutions. NATO, the World Trade Organization, even the UN, were designed to make the stronger powers subject to influence by the weaker powers. And that did two really important things for the United States. First, it created out of weaker powers advocates for the system that we wanted, because Luxembourg may not have a real veto over American power in NATO, but it's never had that much influence over a stronger power's actions before, right? So it's not a perfect system, but if you're a weak power, you would prefer this system to other systems. And the third element of the liberal order as constructed by the United States after 1945 was prosperity, the lure of prosperity that free markets and freeing up trade could provide, that gives countries the incentive, an additional incentive to opt into the order. And here I agree with Patrick, China's the great outlier of this, right? Because if you buy the Hegelian and Fukuyama argument that as basic economic, as people grow more prosperous, they become more demanding political consumers. China may be the outlier to that because for 40 years the government hasn't liberalized as it has been growing dramatically more prosperous. And if you think there is no domestic pressure for political change in China, then they will remain an outlier to this. I personally think moms demanding safe baby milk are going to be what forces China into the liberal order, but that's a debatable proposition. So the liberal order, as the US built it, had three major strains. One about security guarantees, one about establishing rules that you could either be held to or complained about by a common standard or reined in by institutions, and the third, free markets and prosperity that was a tide that was expected to raise all boats. So those are the major elements of the order, and Patrick's certainly right that the United States has a teeth-gnashing, complicated relationship to this as both the architect and the enforcer of the order. My favorite example of the complicatedness of dealing with this is the previously mentioned UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States was the motive force behind its negotiation. We are a signatory to it. No American administration of either political stripe has ever been willing to make the effort to force it through congressional ratification. And yet we not only abide by the terms of it, we enforce the terms of it on others. So he's certainly right. It's a complicated order, but the two central questions, I think, to ask about the liberal international order, whether it exists and whether it should, are first, what would be different if it didn't exist? And Frank Gavin has given three counterfactuals that I think are important for all of us to deal with. The first, he stipulates, is that the rapprochement between France and Germany after World War II would not have happened without American security guarantees, the forced institutionalization of cooperation between them, both in NATO and in the European Union. The second example Frank uses is, it's a hard one to make at the moment, but Britain having a continued interest and involvement in continental European affairs. He thinks that would not have happened without the liberal order, and others here are better placed than me to answer that. The third one, and for me, this is the definitive one, you would not have had the United States remain engaged in the shaping of the international order. That is both because if you look at the record of American involvement from 1898 forward, values matter hugely to persuading the United States to care about the rest of the world. And so, you know, why don't you have a NATO in the Middle East? Because Saudi Arabia isn't Germany. And if you tell my mom, we're going all the way down the line towards the defense of Saudi Arabia, her answer will be, but my daughters never get to grow up to be who they are in Saudi Arabia, but they would in Germany. And so the three strains are inseparable, and values is a driver in this because it's the natural limit of American commitments. And to get American commitments to things like defense of NATO allies, there has to be a shared values component to it to get Americans to remain engaged in the world. Is it perfect? No. Would you like a different order? Because that's the other question. That for all of its failings, we have been so safe and so prosperous for so long that we have forgotten that the people who constructed this order weren't leftist professors sitting around the faculty lounge deciding how we should shape this. It was the hard men who had to fight Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and they built this order because they were scared that the history of the first half of the 20th century was normal, and they wanted to try and build buffers in to reduce the likelihood of that kind of conflict, to give early warning that those kinds of conflicts were shaping up, and to create different possible trajectories. And I think to some extent they have achieved that, and it is now ebbing away in ways that if we don't think seriously about how to make it more successful than it is now, we will end up regretting when another power has the ability to set the rules and shape the order. Because as dislikable as the liberal international order that the United States and its allies created after 1945 is, try and imagine a Russian order or a Chinese order. And I suspect most people in the what I nostalgically call the free world will like that an awful lot less.
Okay, well, thank you both for an absolutely brilliant way of kicking us off. I have lots of questions, and luckily you've kept in time, so there's plenty of time. And the way we'll organise this is that I will ask a question to Patrick next, in which he also gets a chance to respond to Kori, and likewise I'll throw a curveball at you two, Kori, in a moment. So prepare yourself, have a drink, get ready. Okay, Patrick, my first question to you is, I have a comment and then a question. My comment is that the lullaby you described, and I speak as a historian, I recognize that there's been a bit of myth-making about this liberal international order. I think there's probably a distinction between those who talk about a liberal post-Cold War liberal international order and those who accept that ambiguous moral strategic choices were taken before that. I say that as someone whose mother was arrested outside the US Embassy protesting against the American bombing of Cambodia. So there's that back history, and then there's a more recent version of it. And I accept also there's been a bit of myth-making around it. But I want to go to the very core of your argument and the line on which you finished, which you said that what you need is a dose of realism, and you said the job of realism is to strip away euphemism. And I want to actually counter that and to say, let's say this order you described is hypocritical. Let's say this order you described is slightly self-delusional in that to a certain extent we don't even realize the hypocrisy underlying a lot of it or the ambiguous moral choices. This, of course, is what German theorists of statecraft said about the British Empire in the 19th century. They described British attempts to establish international law, of course a crucial pillar of a liberal international order. They described it as a system of privileged piracy, protecting gains and grabs, that the British had got there first and then, confronted with power, strength, revanchism, always cried foul that people were challenging this liberal order the British had built. So we've been here before, we've had criticisms of it before, but my realist counterpoint to you is that this order, while self-delusional, while you could argue has had a role in leading to foreign policy errors, you could say, argue that, and I know you have argued this, that there was a liberal international order case for going to war in Iraq, for example. All that having been said, an order which has lasted so long, which does have a kind of an organizing myth, which does have inbuilt into it at least a sense of values, a sense of contract, a sense of collective security, a sense of shared prosperity. There actually is a little bit more of a hidden realism in that pursuit of order, and much as the debate today can be floppy and amorphous, actually, if you take away that myth and you take away that story, I mean, Edmund Burke's understanding of realism would be you need euphemism, you need myth, you need narrative, you need collected wisdom or memory as well. So are you in danger of stripping the altars entirely and burning everything down, leaving us, as Dr. Schake said, with not much in its place, or an order we would rather not have to deal with, imperfect as the one is we have today?
Well, thanks for asking. And thank you very much to everybody for the chance to indulge in my favourite pastime, which is railing against the foreign policy establishment while also trying to join it at the same time. to yoke together these two challenges, I keep hearing about World War II and the vision of what was created after World War II. This is a very mid-20th century set of ambitions, and rightly so. And I have to agree with Kori that it was better than anything we'd had before. But we're not here to talk about the goodness of the order. We're here to talk about the liberal qualities or otherwise of the order. And such advantages as it had were just as much to do with prudent compromise as idealism. But even if it was the best thing, the fact is, and this is where Kori and I diverge. The fact is that is it sensible? The question is it sensible to use as a standard of judgment a set of atypical circumstances that we derived from the end of World War II and the 1950s, or indeed the 1990s? An artificially high level of relative power, a superpower that, for example, emerged from World War II as the greatest creditor, with 2/3 of the gold reserves, with overwhelming maritime air advantage, with a monopoly on the atomic bomb, with Europe and Eurasia blasted flat by World War II. I think this is the exception, not the norm. And whether we like it or not, whether we desire it or not, a new world order is upon us, not because we've chosen it, but because of the overwhelming structural pressures. And this is where I think a deeper disagreement, that Kori and Kori's side of the argument tends to talk about this in terms of American agency and political choice, that if only America had the political will, it could sustain and indeed resuscitate this corpse, this thing, and keep this thing going. This show could run and run. If only we could do that. I think that's analytically wrong. I think that due to a number of things, the shift in wealth in the world, the shift of world product, the arrival of very disruptive military technologies are making the world a much larger place that's harder to conquer, that it's actually no one's world. It's not the case that we're going to have a Russian or Chinese alternative world. We have got a world of what I call competitive multipolarity. Now, if that's right, if that is true, and if that is something we can't reverse, even if we want to, then the choice is, how do we best adapt to that? I think the best approach is not to be fatalistic and say, well, therefore we've got to gear up for the great clash, which I think the Trump administration is sort of doing. We've got to see if we can negotiate some bargains. We've got to see if we can settle these areas of potential flashpoints and instability. Might not work. It might be that we're on a collision course and it's too late, but I think it's worth a try. On the question of euphemism, I think you're absolutely right. For our identity, we do need simple stories. I mean, that has to be true. But once those simple stories gravitate too far away from brutal realities, that's when we're in trouble. There has to be some And in a very Kissingerian way, and you know this better than I do, you do need a dialogue between morality and power here. Power without morality is soulless, and morality without power is meaningless and futile. I do think we could mobilise, but if you're right, that we do need some alternative myth-making, then I think the people, dare I say that very inflammatory term, could be appealed to, because I think there is a common sense bread and butter realism out there to be talked about. The problem is not the underclass or the working class or the electorate. I think the problem is we have an overclass problem, an overclass that is clinging to myths that don't work. I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to pick up on your comment, and I'm going to ask Dr. Schake her uncomfortable question. And it's based also on what I read into your most recent book, Safe Passage, as well. And I just want to put my hand up here and say, as the only Brit on the stage, that we haven't got enough credit yet for our involvement or our infamy.
I've got a passport as well. Sorry.
In the process of international ordering, and you make that case in your book as well, Kori. So in that book, you say that you have in this great power transition between the United Kingdom to the United States, or the British Empire to the United States, more accurately, an odd and unusual and historically contingent convergence of worldviews. And you say that there are accidents in this story, and there was nothing inevitable at that sort of passover, but you do, in that Safe Passage, describe a convergence of ideas and understandings about the way the world should work, and the way in which the American commercial empire of the 20th century adopted or mimicked or converged with aspects of the British commercial empire of the 19th century. So that is a historically contingent process or program, and as Patrick said, there is a significant challenge to the myth that came up around that Second World War, post-Second World War international order, in which, of course, Britain played a significant and influential role. And others have written about the fact that that was primarily an elite endeavour, that in the British case, it was certainly about maintaining the elements and functions of the British Empire thereafter. In the American case, of course, in a lot of cases, the Ivy League schools or the great international relations schools that trained Americans up for the world of order, world of international order, as some people have written, were funded by great American corporations, business, etc., that it had a kind of an East Coast tilt to it, that it was an elite endeavour. And it also has been a generational endeavour as well, and a lot of what we've seen recently is a kind of a new generation coming up who haven't been trained in the same way, haven't thought about it in the same way, particularly at universities, where you've had a challenge to that. So, if in your book you argue that this order was historically contingent, and if you accept that we've had these unique circumstances, isn't it time, therefore, isn't the Pandora's box already open? Isn't the challenge put down? It's too easy to dismiss the challenge put down by Steve Bannon and others. But basically, if you look at America's interest in preserving this order, that Americans have had enough of the business of doing this. They weren't necessarily sure about it in 1945, and they had to be coaxed into it. And now they're tired and bored and exhausted, and their friends that they used to involve themselves in the ordering business are less effective and less interested in doing it themselves. So really, isn't it time, therefore, to think beyond the liberal international order and go over to Patrick's side?
It's an excellent question, John. Thank you. I would be more worried about the challenge that you pose if we were one generation from World War II, right? The rebellious children of 1968 somehow found a way to think that this order merited sustaining. The enervated boredom of the children of the 80s somehow still thought that. And the reason is because we can't find a better answer than this. So it has survived the multiculturalism of American elites. It has survived the generational passage of time of American elites, and not just American elites. But one of the things that is so interesting and so different about the liberal international order is how little bandwagoning you see against it by other strong powers. Because with the exception of China, the strongest, most prosperous states in the international order are all participants in this liberal order and are all either overtly or loosely tied to the United States, and they are the ones, much more than Americans, clamoring for the sustainment of this order. And Patrick argues that it's unsustainable because it's too expensive or because power is shifting. And you argue that it's unsustainable because Americans are sick and tired of this. But as you point out, John, Americans aren't newly sick and tired of this. We've always been sick and tired of this. Right? Eisenhower and Dulles have a conversation in a National Security Council meeting in 1956 where they agree that the NATO idea has lost its appeal and we've got to find something different and better, right? The agonizing reappraisal of the Eisenhower administration when France vetoes the European Defense Community. We're always disappointed in the other countries of the liberal international order. We always think they do too little. We would love to trade them in for better allies. Sadly, we cannot find any better allies to trade them in for. But what we do see is the slow migration of most countries into voluntary compliance with the rules, into at least flirtation with wanting to join the liberal order because they're scared of what else might come. And here, non-aligned India, for example, is, much to be courted and not yet to be had, but it did just sign an information sharing arrangement with the American Pentagon because they're worried about Chinese behavior in Doklam and other places. And so the magnetism of the liberal international order may not be absolute, and Patrick's right about its many failings, but it has a lot of relative advantages. And so the people who want to sustain it are, for the most part, the very countries who traditional international relations theory would tell us ought to be wanting to tear it down, right? Even the Chinese premier goes to Davos and talks about China as the great savior of the rules-based international order. So they understand that voluntary appeal of it has a lot of attractions. So competitive multipolarity may be the alternative we're looking at, but the magnetic attraction of opting in is what has managed previous rounds of that. And as to unaffordability, the Eisenhower administration spent almost 40% of US GDP on defense policy at the start of its term. The US spends 1/10 of that now. And part of the reason it spends so little and has such enormous sway is that other countries help us support and sustain the rules. And that's where the voluntary nature of compliance makes it cost effective. So the reason Bannon's argument I think will ultimately not carry is that as you start to look at what the erosion of the rules means for us, and you start to realize that if you don't have any friends to hold hands with, the world not just looks scarier, it looks a lot more difficult to manage. And so that's why this order, generation after generation, is what the U.S. keeps choosing and what other countries keep choosing as well.
Okay, thank you both. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for questions, and we have roving mics as well. There's a gentleman here. I'm not sure of House rules. You have to state your name and organisation. So just, you do have to state your name and organisation?
Happy to do so. Jonathan Marcus of the BBC World Service. You've stressed the importance of values. You've stressed the importance of the enforcement of rules. What do we do when the founder of this order seems to be the prime exponent of not enforcing those rules or enforcing them in an ever partisan fashion, and certainly in many ways doesn't live up to the values of this liberal order? Doesn't that present a fundamental challenge and a new challenge that we haven't faced in the past?
Do you want to answer that, Patrick?
Should we take a few?
Yeah, that's not about it, actually. Let's take a few questions. There's another gentleman just here we'll take those two and then we'll proceed with two.
Hi there, Dan Rycroft from the University of East Anglia. I'm very interested in the context in which these kinds of debates emerge. You know, how they become relevant is actually a very interesting and important point. I wanted to really, I suppose, pick up on the potential to kind of shift the debate slightly around specifics, namely the UN and the Charter of the UN, for example. If we're talking about liberal world orders, this seems to be a platform through which change can happen, but at some cost and at, you know, in terms of a time frame, rather kind of a long process. But I wanted to encourage you to reflect, if possible, on the possibilities for charter reform in and amongst questions around UN reform.
Okay, thank you. So we have two questions there. I'm going to split them between Kori and Patrick. I'll give you the UN one, and I'll start with you, Kori. What happens if the defender of the international order is not behaving in a way befitting of the international order?
So, first of all, I agree with the premise of the question, that the biggest danger to the liberal order at the moment is not a rising China, but it's a frothing, febrile United States. The Trump administration has given all of us political scientists a glorious era of tests of fundamental questions. And one of the fundamental questions you rightly point to is the liberal order, does the liberal order require American leadership to be sustained? I think it is robust enough to the institutions, the norms, the middle powers who are committed to it, make it robust enough to sustain a period of 10 or maybe even 15 years of willful destruction by the United States, but probably not more than that. Moreover, I think I see the middle powers of the liberal order organizing in order to buffer it against American destruction. So the Canadians, Mexicans, Chileans, Japanese, Australians, and South Koreans bringing the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership into effect despite American withdrawal from it. And the way France and Britain and Australia are cooperating to carry out freedom of navigation operations, the way the Japanese are strengthening the coast guards of the Philippines and Vietnam in order to help them preserve the law of the sea. I think I see a lot of mobilization by middle powers that will make the liberal order even more robust as the United States steps away. A couple of years ago, John Eikenberry, one of the main proponents of this idea of a liberal international order, argued that you know, the perfect functioning of the system would be when the United States became irrelevant to it. And I do think, but I am skeptical the liberal order is robust enough to actually be self-sustaining. I do think it needs a leader and, as Patrick emphasized, an enforcer of the rules. And if the United States slips out of that role, it will become frayed at the edges and possibly worse. But I am also more optimistic than it sounds like either John or Patrick are, that my sweet provincial country will right itself short of a 15-year time frame. And let me just give you my favorite example, which is, despite the hostility of the federal government of the United States to the Paris Climate Accords, and despite our withdrawal from those accords, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, suggested several weeks ago that the first country that was going to meet its Paris Climate Accords standards is the United States of America. And it's because the great golden state of California and the city of Chicago and Michael Bloomberg's money and Apple computers and the do-gooders all over the country are actually going to drag us there irrespective of federal government hostility. So the great virtue of liberal societies isn't so much our governments as it's our societies. And I do think the U.S. is having a big, messy, angry public debate right now, which will 5 or 10 years from now, Patrick is going to be buying me a steak dinner because the liberal international order, we're not even going to be having this debate because it's going to be settled again. And so I hope you'll take that wager, Patrick.
Okay. Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah.
I really wish I could remember where I read this, but there was an incident in the late 70s when a Vietnamese communist envoy was approached by a United Nations official who said, your invasion into Cambodia to end the genocide of the killing fields, why didn't you come to the United Nations? Why did you just do this unauthorized thing? It's such a powerful thing to do, such an important, dare I say it, rules-based thing to do. And the Vietnamese envoy thought for a while and said, well, we thought about that, but then we remembered that 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council had invaded Vietnam in the past century. So we don't regard that body as having necessarily the moral authority that you do. I tell that story to caution against what I think is becoming rather too much of an obsession with the formalities of rules and institutions. As though they can actually abolish historical memory and power politics. The Vietnamese envoy remembered something we often forget, that these things have not replaced the arbitrariness of power or the arbitrariness of self-interest. To talk about the world as a place where rules are consistently enforced by the good is fundamentally to misunderstand the much more tragic and compromised nature of international life. I'm struck that advocates, for example, of striking Syria to deter the use of chemical weapons often talk about themselves as taking the rules-based side of the argument, not contending with the problem that that kind of action would need to be authorised by permanent members, at least one of whom would veto it. But we keep on wanting to invest our actions with sort of the authority of police behaviour. What we're actually arguing for is a vigilante's privilege. I think it's time to start more honest about that. I can understand someone saying, we are the top dog, we are the superpower, we know better, we see further, and we will take actions that we would not tolerate from others in the name of the greater good, and you're just going to have to put up with it. I can understand that. I can even understand someone secretly thinking it while saying something else. What I can't abide is the forgetting of this and the talking about this as though it were really true. And I think it's time to actually be a bit honest in this debate. Otherwise, you have the situation, for example, where the President of the Council on Foreign Relations recently tweeted that we should treat Russia, Putin's Russia, as a rogue state because it has violated centuries of Westphalian sovereign norms on one day, and then a few days later says the United Nations should unilaterally back a coup in Venezuela. That's the absurdity. And if we're worried about legitimacy, if we're worried about soft power, if we're worried about legitimating American power, very large parts of the world do notice this. There was the other point about those rules versus order.
Okay, fine. For now. I'm policing
yeah.
you.
Sure.
Kori, you wanted to come in very quickly?
I just wanted to, I agree with Patrick's point about the contradictions in Richard's statements about Syria and Venezuela. I do think the Syria case is slightly more complicated than you describe it. It's not that you are simply breaking rules in order to do what you want in Syria. There actually is a rule that strikes on Syria are upholding, which is the chemical weapons, the convention opposing chemical weapons use, which the Syrians are doing. So there is, what you see in Syria is the conflicting positive outcomes. Do you uphold UN sovereignty and the rules of taking no military action, or do you uphold the rule that Syria is also a signatory of and in violation of, that the use of chemical weapons is uniquely barbaric and therefore will be policed even in the context of conventional wars?
Okay, we're going to take another flurry of questions just as everyone's getting warmed up.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Patrick's ready to go. There's a gentleman at the back and then there's a gentleman at the front. Name an organisation, please. Just gentleman at the back here. At the very back.
Way further back, otherwise known as Dana Allen.
Thank you. Dana Allen from the IISS. A couple cheap shots at Professor Porter and then a maybe more serious question. I mean, somebody may have already said this, but I do think you set yourself too easy a task in pointing out that order has been a system that combines elements of order, elements and liberalism, and elements of power involves degrees of hypocrisy and coercion. I'm sort of another cheap shot. Well, no, actually, this may be a more serious point. It may be true that the United States was complicit with Franco's Spain under this system. It's also true that Spain became a democracy under it. Excuse me. But what you said that I think we all do really have to take seriously is the idea that, if I remember what you said correctly, that sort of the idea of a global liberal order is a kind of myth that an overclass uses to justify itself. And I mean, I think there has to be something to that in the sense that we see a revolt against that. But in that revolt, haven't we come to a point where you sort of have to choose sides? You have to ask the question, will Brits of all classes, or of any class, be better off when Britain leaves the European Union? Or is it just as well that Donald Trump is sort of blowing up and repudiating this idea of liberal order? I mean, I don't think there's a lot of evidence for either proposition.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the front row.
Ben Barry, I'm with the IISS. Can I offer some red team points? Has not the liberal international order shot itself in the foot 3 times? Firstly, with the excesses of neoliberal economics, greatly increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots disproportionately and crashing the whole magic money tree down 10 years ago. Secondly, with the failure of the Iraq and Afghanistan interventions, which greatly diminished the utility of force as exercised by the liberal order. And finally, by the great golden state of California inventing all this wonderful information technology, including the smartphone, that makes what the haves have much more visible to what the have-nots don't have.
Okay, brilliant questions. I think we can squeeze one more in. There's a gentleman over here, and then I'll ask our panelists to wrap up so we can finish in good time.
Thank you. My name is Gautam Gabriel from the University of Cambridge. My question is for Professor Porter. And is there any, what are the competing visions for order that accompany the transition to multipolarity? And if the order was not liberal to begin with, what are we transiting to? Is it simply a power shift, or is there some sort of, something else? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time. The way I think we should divide these, Patrick, if you take the first and third, which were directed at you,
sure.
And then Kori will get the middle question, but also the final word, as it is her home fixture. So there you go, Patrick.
So the quite serious challenge is that I've got an easy target here, that this is too easy to point out. But George Orwell once said that the hardest thing to admit is a thing that's right in front of your nose. And my question is, if it's so very obvious that all international power exercised by a hegemon must be compromised and must involve double standards and imperial behaviour and inconsistency, if that's so very self-evident, why do I see so little acknowledgement of that in these liberal order panegyrics? Why does it take a lot of us skeptics to point it out before the point starts being engaged? I think it's because it does actually upset the story. If you go through the literature that has come out, particularly since the election of Donald Trump, that talks about this Camelot period, you'll find rules-based, liberal, order, all sorts of words repeated manifold times. You won't see Nagasaki, you won't see napalm, you won't see Suharto. I think you ought to see those things, and I think it's actually a criticism of the original work I'm attacking that it doesn't engage those things. The question of competing visions. I would recommend everyone to read the books that my co-panelists have written in different ways about this. Kori's book recently, Safe Passage, about a very successful effort of Britain to appease a rising United States at the turn of the 20th century, and John's work on Castlereagh and Realpolitik about the statesmen of Europe in 1815 working out what to do with a defeated France in a revolutionary Europe and how to negotiate some kind of transition. I can't say in advance how it might work, but there does have to be some kind of equivalent of a Yalta II with Russia. There does have to be some kind of equivalent of a Nixon-Mao with China, working out areas where we can either deconflict or compromise, and also finding in a more positive sense what are the things we have in common. That may not work. I absolutely agree that, and it actually may now be too late. I say that as well. That this might be over. This debate might be too late in the making, but we have to try and find out.
On the liberal order shooting itself in the foot, yes, yes, and yes. One of the things that is striking about the post-1945 order, though, is how resilient it is in recovering from mistakes. If you think about times of kind of maximum American influence, the mid-1950s and the early 1970s. In 1956, the National Guard was forcibly integrating American schools. You still have McCarthy hearings going on in the United States. So it's not that we are imperfect now, it's that we've been imperfect all along the way. And the mistakes, I agree with you, the titanic, self-indulgent mistakes of the post-Cold War period by the United States and other liberal countries are a series of self-goals. Is that right? The
Own
right
goals.
football term?
Own
Own
goals.
goals. Thank you, John. He's still coaching me. But the other thing that's striking is the first economy to recover its footing after the 2008 financial crisis, which the United States triggered off with our own lax and what was Walter Russell Mead's fabulous term, financial esprit, that is inherent in the United States. That is our tolerance for repeated bankruptcy. And yet the dollar is still the holding currency of the international order. $1 trillion a year debt we are racking up in our federal government, and the dollar's still the holding currency. Why is that? It's because it's still a better bet than the euro or the yuan or other alternatives. And so it's not an absolute case you're making, it's a relative case you're making. And the one thing that liberal societies are good at and the liberal order is good at is fixing its problems.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. There's no way I can kind of do justice to the quality and depth of that conversation. I'll finish up just with two observations sparked by the last question. First observation is that actually the initial post-Second World War international order was actually based in the British terms on Keynesian economics in a bigger, broader sense, and this is one of John Eikenberry's arguments, on a kind of a new deal for the world. So one can see the post-2008 ramifications of the financial crash and what is called, accurately or not, neoliberalism, and how that the sort of economic motor of that order has shifted quite significantly. And the second thing is just to say that when I was thinking about this debate on the way here, actually, it's a mistake to presume this is simply Brexit and Trump-centric, and really you can date from Kissinger's 2014 book World Order, or essays like Robert Kagan's essay on superpowers don't get to retire, that this sort of anxiety about the shifting international order is something that predates that, and it is cyclical, and we have been through periods in time in the past when that has happened as well. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'd like to, above all, thank our two debaters for keeping it clean and enlightening, and I hope you went away convinced, terrified, or reassured, one of those three. Okay, thank you very much.